Welcome to a quiet night of ghostly tales. As the world slows down, we'll drift through haunted places and restless spirits, carried softly by stories meant to guide you into sleep. Do you believe ghosts are echoes of the past, or something still watching us now? Let me know your thoughts, and together, let's step into the whispers of the unknown. I wasn't looking for a job when I found Marrow Hill Cemetery. I was just looking for silence. After years of working late shifts in crowded, buzzing places, I thought a graveyard would be the calmest corner of the world. The listing was simple. Night watchman needed. Must not be afraid of the dark. I laughed when I read it. By the time I arrived at the gates, the last traces of sunlight were slipping behind the hills, and the whole cemetery was bathed in that blue-gray glow that never feels like night or day. The iron gate creaked open with a reluctant moan, as if it had been shut too long. Beyond it stretched a landscape of uneven ground, black trees, and rows upon rows of tombstones leaning like tired soldiers. I remember thinking it smelled oddly sweet, not of flowers, but of damp soil that had been recently disturbed. The caretaker's office sat near the edge, a squat brick building with one light still burning. Inside, the air was stale, filled with dust, and a faint scent of old wax. On the desk lay a stack of forms, a brass key, and a single notebook covered in black leather. Written across it in careful handwriting were the words, "The Rules of the Dead." Oh, I assumed it was a joke left by the previous watchman, until I flipped through it. The first page listed numbered instructions, each stranger than the last. Never walk between the same grave twice. Do not whistle after midnight. If you see your shadow move before you do not follow it. And there were a dozen more, each one written in a tone too serious to be playful. Pinned beside the notebook was a faded photograph, a man in uniform standing near the same office door, his face blurred by age. On the back, someone had written, "Caretaker, Samuel H. Dyer." The date was nearly 40 years old. I didn't meet any Samuel that night. The manager who hired me by phone never showed. I assumed he'd left the keys and gone home, so I began my rounds. The graveyard was larger than it looked from the road. Paths twisted in gentle curves, splitting into smaller trails that vanished behind old mausoleums. I carried a lantern, though the faint moonlight seemed to follow me, reflecting off marble and metal plaques. Every sound carried strangely here, the rustle of dry grass, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, in that heavy way silence can sometimes be, until I noticed the graves weren't where I remembered them. I had walked past a tall angel statue earlier, wings spread wide, one arm raised toward the sky. When I passed the same area again half an hour later, the angel was gone. In its place stood a weathered cross, half buried in ivy. I thought I had lost my bearings, but when I turned around, the paths themselves seemed different, curving in directions they hadn't before. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself I was tired or imagining things. But when I looked down at my lantern's glow, I realized the shadows of the stones around me were swaying slightly, though the trees above were perfectly still. Back in the office, I wrote down what I saw, half laughing at myself. Maybe the caretaker who wrote those rules saw things too. Maybe this place had a way of playing with your sense of direction. Before turning in for the night, I flipped open the notebook again, this time reading the last line written in a firmer, darker hand. Do not question the layout of the graves. The cemetery remembers where everything belongs. Something about that made my stomach tighten. Outside, the air pressed against the windows like a slow, rhythmic breath. The light flickered once, then steadied. I told myself it was just an old bulb, the hum of power lines, somewhere underground. But when I turned to lock the door, I caught sight of something new through the glass. A headstone near the gate, one that hadn't been there before. Fresh, clean stone gleaming white beneath the moonlight. From where I stood, I could just barely read the name carved into it. It was the name of a man I knew from town, and below it, a date of death that hadn't happened yet. My heart skipped, and I blinked, thinking the moonlight must be playing tricks. I pressed my nose against the glass, trying to make sense of it. The letters were clear and sharp, like someone had carved them moments ago, yet the dirt around the grave was undisturbed, almost as if the earth itself had opened and closed with no effort. I grabbed my lantern and stepped outside, boots crunching against the gravel. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, but curiosity rooted me in place. The air was colder than I expected, carrying a faint smell of rain on dry soil. I walked slowly toward the headstone, counting each step as if it could keep me tethered to reality. When I reached it, the stone was smooth and icy, almost unnervingly alive beneath my fingers. I ran my hand over the carved name again. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I had to fight the urge to stumble backward. How could this be real? The man whose name glared back at me from the stone was alive, walking in town, drinking coffee at the diner just hours ago. I backed away and nearly tripped over a small root curling across the path. That's when I noticed the shadows moving again. Not the ones cast by the moon or by my lantern, but smaller, darker, subtle shapes shifting among the graves, writhing like smoke. I stopped breathing, frozen, watching them stretch and fade, then vanish entirely. I ran back to the office, heart hammering, and slammed the door behind me. The notebook was still open, waiting for me as if it had never been touched. I traced my fingers over the rules again, desperate for some explanation. Never walk between the same grave twice. That one kept repeating in my mind. I remembered the angel statue, the cross that hadn't been there before. Perhaps the cemetery wasn't just shifting for fun. Perhaps it was testing me. I spent the rest of the night patrolling in smaller circles, avoiding the paths I had walked earlier. Every so often I would catch glimpses of shapes in the corner of my eyes, tall figures that froze when I looked directly at them. I told myself I was tired, imagining things, hallucinating from too many late-night shifts. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. This place was alive, not in the way grass grows or trees sway in the wind, but in a way that watched, calculated, and remembered. By the time dawn was a pale smear on the horizon, I had covered nearly every path I could reach. Nothing else seemed to appear, and the headstone by the gate was gone. It had vanished entirely, leaving behind only trampled grass. I wanted to feel relief, but instead I felt dread pressing against my chest like a heavy stone. I had glimpsed the cemetery's secrets, and it knew I had. I started noticing small changes the next night. Headstones that I was certain hadn't been there yesterday now stood in rows I had memorized. The angel statue returned, but its gaze followed me more sharply than before. I began to keep a log, writing down each grave I passed, the way the paths curved, and every odd occurrence. I didn't want to rely on memory anymore. I needed proof that this place was bending reality in ways I couldn't comprehend. Then, 3 nights later, I saw it again, a new headstone in the very center of the cemetery. Its surface glimmered slightly in the lantern light, as though wet, though the earth around it was dry. And on it, carved deep into the stone, was another name. This one belonged to a local woman I knew well, someone I had spoken to the day before. My hand shook as I held the lantern closer, trying to read the date beneath. It wasn't a date from the past. It was a future date, a death that hadn't occurred yet. I staggered back, nearly dropping the lantern, and felt the air thicken. A cold wind rose from nowhere, swirling around the graves in little spirals. I could hear whispers now, soft, almost indistinguishable, like voices carried on the wind calling names. The whispers grew louder as I listened, threading through the rows of stones, brushing against my ears. The notebook lay open on the desk as if waiting for me to record what I had seen. I picked it up and turned to the last few pages. There, in a hurried hand, the caretaker had scrawled a warning that made my stomach knot tighter than ever. Names appear before the dead come. Those who see them are bound to the cemetery. Watch carefully, follow the rules, or you will join the rest. I dropped the notebook onto the desk, and my lantern flickered. Outside, I thought I saw the shadows gathering closer, hovering just beyond the window panes. I realized then that I wasn't just guarding a cemetery. I was walking among a place that lived, breathed, and decided fates long before the living understood them. I stayed awake the rest of that night, watching the paths and counting shadows, listening to the whispers, and wondering which name would appear next. I had taken the job for peace, but peace was nowhere here. Only the rules, the stones, and the feeling that every step I took was already remembered by something far older and far more patient than myself. The nights at Marrow Hill grew heavier as I settled into my routine. By now, I knew that the cemetery had its own rhythm, a pulse that I could feel in the soles of my feet and in the chill that never left my bones. Every evening, I walked the same loops, carrying my lantern, following paths that seemed to shift beneath me, and noting every new stone, every subtle movement of shadows. But even the smallest deviation from the rules was enough to stir the cemetery into action. One night I rounded a bend near the mausoleum at the far end of the graveyard and froze. In the pale lantern light, a figure stood among the gravestones, tall, dark, and impossibly still. At first I thought it was another visitor, some local taking an ill-advised midnight stroll. But the air around it was too cold, the ground beneath its feet untouched, and there was a weightless quality to its stance, like it wasn't entirely part of this world. I held my lantern higher, the flame wobbling as my hands shook. The figure didn't move. It didn't even blink. Then slowly, it raised a hand pointing toward a fresh headstone that had appeared since my last patrol. I swallowed hard and forced myself to step closer. The stone glimmered, still wet-looking, with a name I knew. A boy from town, alive and well. But beneath his name was a date tomorrow. My stomach twisted. The cemetery wasn't just marking the dead. It was predicting them. I turned away, my heart pounding, and tried to ignore the figure. But every path I walked that night felt wrong, unfamiliar. The shadows were longer than the trees could cast, darker than the night itself, and they shifted in ways that made me dizzy. I remembered the rule: never walk between the same grave twice. I tried to follow it, counting each step, making mental notes of every stone. Yet somehow, by midnight, I found myself standing between two graves I was certain I had already passed. Then the whispers came. Not soft this time, clear and insistent. Names again. The living and the dead intermingled in the calls. My own name was among them. My lantern flickered violently, throwing everything into chaotic, jerking shadows. The figure in the distance had moved closer, but only slightly, and I knew it didn't need to walk. It hovered, patient, waiting. I ran. Not for any specific direction, but anywhere the paths seemed to open. My lantern swung wildly, illuminating rows of graves that shifted as I passed. Tombstones I had memorized were now rearranged. Angels turned to face me, crosses leaning unnaturally. I could hear my boots echo against the hollow silence of the cemetery, my own heartbeat thundering in response. Finally, I stopped near the office. My chest heaving, I pressed my back against the door and looked around. Everything appeared normal for a moment. The air stilled, the shadows dissolved, and then I saw it. A headstone at the very edge of the gate, just like the first one I had encountered. The name etched into the stone made me freeze. It was mine. My own name, carved in sharp, icy letters, with a date that hadn't yet come. I reached out instinctively. touching the smooth, chilling surface, and the stone trembled beneath my fingers. It wasn't solid. It had a faint pulse, like something alive and waiting. I stumbled backward, terrified, my lantern clattering to the ground and casting frantic beams of light in every direction. I opened the notebook again, desperate for guidance. There, in a hurried scrawl that made my eyes burn with fear, the previous caretaker had written something I had never noticed before. If your name appears, do not panic. You are not dead yet, but you are seen. The cemetery watches all who linger. You must obey, or you will join the stones. I swallowed hard and my throat dry. Every hair on my body stood on end. The cemetery had chosen to notice me. The rules were no longer abstract warnings. They were chains, invisible but unbreakable. And I had broken one already by walking the same paths twice. That night I didn't sleep. I didn't leave the office. I sat with the notebook in my lap, lantern casting weak light across the pages, and listened. The whispers never stopped. Shadows moved just beyond my vision. Each name called carried weight, pulling at me with a force I could not resist. I understood with a chill that seeped into my bones that I had become part of this place. Not a visitor, not a guardian, something else. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped into the graveyard, I was shaking. The headstone with my name had vanished, but the knowledge that it had existed and would exist again settled over me like a heavy fog. I understood then that the cemetery did not sleep. It could not. It remembered everything, and it watched everyone. I realized something else, too. This was only the beginning. The whispers would continue. The stones would continue to appear. And I would continue to walk these paths, bound by rules older than any living soul, learning the way the cemetery moved and deciding, in small ways, which names would appear next. Each night, Marrow Hill reminded me of one simple truth. It was not just a resting place for the dead. It was a living, breathing entity, and I had become part of its eternal watch. The days offered little comfort. In the daylight, Marrow Hill looked like any other cemetery sun glinting off worn gravestones, birds rustling through the branches, a faint breeze carrying the scent of flowers and damp earth. I tried to convince myself that the horrors of the night were illusions, tricks of exhaustion and imagination. But every morning my mind replayed the whispers, the shadows, the names etched into stone before their time. I began to notice patterns. The cemetery seemed to breathe with a rhythm, almost like a pulse beneath the soil. Stones appeared in clusters, often marking people I had seen during the day. Sometimes the names belonged to strangers, people I didn't know. Sometimes they were friends, neighbors, people whose lives I could trace with a casual conversation at the diner. And each name carried a weight, a certainty that made my stomach tighten. The notebook became my lifeline. I read and reread the caretaker's warnings, memorizing the rules. Some seemed simple. Do not touch the fresh stones, never retrace your steps, avoid the shadowed paths near the old mausoleum. Others were more cryptic. The cemetery remembers kindness. The unburied remember hunger. I didn't fully understand what that meant, but I could feel its truth in the tremor of the air around me at night and the subtle shifting of stones under my feet. Then came the night when the rules were no longer enough. I had been walking the northern path, counting the graves, careful not to cross between any I had passed before. The shadows had grown longer, darker, stretching like fingers toward me. I noticed the figure standing beneath a twisted oak, its form thin and ragged, as though cobwebs and shadows had shaped it. The figure did not move, but I could feel its gaze on me, burning with attention. I held my lantern higher, the flame trembling, and saw its face, or rather, what should have been a face. There was only darkness, the void of something that had never lived. I tried to step backward, but my feet seemed rooted to the ground. And then I heard my name. whispered, soft but unmistakable. My heart froze. The sound came not from the figure, but from everywhere, a chorus of voices, some familiar, some not. They seemed to seep from the earth itself. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape, but the cemetery's layout had changed. Paths I had known were gone, replaced with gravestones I had never seen, carved in fresh marble, names still wet. One of them bore my name again, although the date was blank this time. I touched the cold surface, and the stone shivered beneath my fingers, like a heartbeat that was not my own. The whispers grew louder. Names and warnings intertwined, overlapping, forming phrases I could barely comprehend. Follow the rules. Do not interfere. The cemetery remembers. And underneath it all, a deeper, slower voice, almost mine but older and weary. You belong here. I realized then that I could never leave. The gates were a lie. Every exit I tried led me back to the center of the cemetery. Every path I ran, every step I took, circled me back to the stones. The night had become endless, stretching beyond comprehension, a labyrinth built of shadows, marble, and whispers. I began to understand the true purpose of the rules. They were not suggestions. They were protections, boundaries drawn to keep the living from joining the dead prematurely. Each violation of a rule made the cemetery aware of me in ways I did not want. Each misstep was remembered. Each name I saw carved before its time reminded me that the dead were not silent observers. They were participants, patient and meticulous, keeping track of everything, waiting for the right moment. By the time the first pale light of dawn threatened to break the night, I had learned something more terrifying than the whispers, the shifting paths, or the stone that bore my name. I had learned that Marrow Hill was not just a cemetery. It was a living memory, a conscious entity that consumed attention, time, and life itself. Every headstone was a record, every shadow a sentinel, and I, the watchman, was part of its eternal calculation. I returned to the office, exhausted beyond description, and set the notebook on the desk. I knew I could not leave, yet I could not stop walking either. Marrow Hill had a rhythm, and I was now a participant in it, a step in its endless pattern. The air hummed with the quiet knowledge of the stones, the history of the dead, and the weight of the living. I realized then that the cemetery never sleeps, and neither would I. It had chosen me, and my duty had only just begun. The shadows waited, the whispers waited, and the names would continue to appear, long before their time, reminding me every night that the line between life and death was not fixed, and that at Marrow Hill, the living and the dead were bound by rules older than memory itself. The night was not mine. The cemetery had claimed it, and in claiming the night, it had claimed me. The next night I returned to Marrow Hill Cemetery with a weight in my chest that I could not shake. Each step toward the iron gates felt heavier than the last, as if the cemetery itself was aware of my approach and watching, waiting. The moon hung low and pale, casting a sickly light over the gravestones, illuminating the twisted trees that leaned over the paths like ancient sentinels. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, faintly coppery, that made my stomach churn. I carried the notebook in one hand, lantern in the other. I had memorized as many of the rules as I could, but fear made my mind fuzzy. I walked slowly, deliberately, noting the alignment of each grave, careful not to cross any path twice. The shadows danced at the edges of my vision, stretching unnaturally long, curling toward me like living smoke. Every time I looked directly, they froze, only to continue moving the moment I looked away. I remembered the first rule from the notebook: never walk between the same grave twice. At first, it seemed almost laughable. What harm could come from a simple step? Yet the cemetery had shown me that these instructions were not suggestions. They were commands, and breaking them had consequences. That night I followed a careful, twisting path, counting my steps, remembering each headstone. I refused to glance at the shadows, but the whispers began again. Soft, almost seductive, they called names, mine included, mingling with names of the living. The cemetery seemed alive, its movements subtle at first, then more pronounced. I noticed the stones shift slightly as I passed, a tilt here, a lean there, small adjustments that gave the sense the entire place was aware of my presence. The angel statues along the paths turned their faces toward me when I wasn't looking directly at them. Their wings seemed to pulse slightly, like breathing. I realized that I was not alone, not just in the sense of a spirit hovering nearby, but in the sense that the cemetery itself was a sentient being, observing, recording, waiting. By the time I reached the northern path, I had almost convinced myself to stop questioning it. Yet the whispers grew louder, clearer, weaving words that I could understand. Follow the rules. Watch carefully. Do not touch the stones. The rules from the notebook became more urgent, a lifeline I had to cling to. I realized the caretaker who wrote them had understood far more than I did. He had known that this cemetery was not merely a resting place for the dead, but a place where the living were measured, tested, observed. A fresh headstone appeared ahead of me. I stopped abruptly, lantern swinging. The earth around it was undisturbed, yet the stone glimmered with a wet sheen, as though it had been carved minutes ago. The name etched into it was familiar. It belonged to a man from the town whose death was not yet written in the records, not yet whispered in rumor, not yet mourned. My pulse quickened. This was not coincidence. The cemetery did not make mistakes. The shadows shifted toward the new stone, curling around it like black smoke. The whispers grew into murmurs, rising and falling in an unsettling rhythm. I stepped closer to the grave, trying to understand, to read the date carved beneath the name. It was blank, but the air around the stone felt heavy, expectant, as though it waited for the inevitable. I realized then that the rules were not just for protection. They were a way to survive, a way to exist, without becoming a part of the record. The caretaker had written them carefully, intentionally, knowing that each rule kept the living separate from the dead. Violating them brought attention, and attention from the cemetery was never kind. I turned, slowly scanning the surrounding graves, counting, noting, making sure I had not retraced my steps. That is when I felt it. A presence moving just beyond the lantern light, a figure tall and thin, impossible to see clearly. It did not approach, yet I felt its gaze, a heavy, pressing awareness that made my skin crawl. I remembered another rule: do not follow your shadow if it moves before you. I glanced down at my own shadow. It seemed to stretch ahead of me unnaturally, as though reaching for something. I fought the instinct to follow it. My legs wanted to move, to chase the dark shape that flickered before me. But I remembered the notebook's warning. Following it would be breaking a rule, a grave mistake. My heart raced as I took a deep breath, forcing myself to continue along the correct path. The figure remained, distant yet present, a silent observer that mirrored the cemetery itself, patient, unblinking, waiting. The night pressed on, thick and unyielding. Each new grave, each whisper, each shadow reminded me that the cemetery was not a place to wander carelessly. It demanded respect, attention, and obedience, and I realized with a cold, sinking certainty that I had only just begun to learn its rules. I moved carefully, forcing each step to follow the notebook's guidance. The cemetery seemed to react to every decision I made. If I paused too long, a shadow would drift closer, brushing at the edge of my vision. If I hesitated at a crossroad, the paths themselves seemed to stretch or bend, guiding me toward some unseen judgment. It was no longer just a place to patrol. It was a puzzle, a living entity that required absolute attention. The whispers grew clearer as I continued along the eastern path. They were layered, a chorus of voices, both familiar and foreign. I heard names I recognized from the town, as well as names of people I did not know, spoken with certainty and finality. Every name carried weight, a promise of what was to come. I felt the pull of the cemetery like a tide, drawing me toward the stones, urging me to acknowledge the inevitable. Then I noticed something new. Small movements among the graves, subtle, almost imperceptible at first, like the faint rustle of silk became more pronounced. Stones shifted slightly, their edges catching the lantern light in sharp glints. A marble cross rocked as though pushed by invisible hands. The angel statue's eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went, their carved faces impossibly lifelike, their expressions shifting ever so slightly from night to night. I realized that the cemetery was not only alive, but aware of my understanding. It tested me, observed me, gauged my adherence to its rules. I reached the old mausoleum near the center of the grounds, the one the caretaker had warned me to avoid unless absolutely necessary. Its blackened doors were closed, but I could feel a presence inside, patient and watchful. The air here was colder, heavier, and the whispers were louder, almost frantic. I shivered and glanced down at the notebook. A rule scrawled in a frantic hand jumped out at me. Do not enter the mausoleum. If you are drawn in, you may never return. Despite my fear, my curiosity was stronger. The shadows inside seemed to ripple, moving with a life of their own. I felt something calling me, a pull toward the darkness, a promise that understanding would come if I crossed the threshold. But the rules were clear. I forced myself to step back to resist the temptation. The pull did not relent, though. It pressed at the edges of my mind, whispering, nudging, reminding me that the cemetery did not forgive mistakes. I turned to continue my patrol, careful not to retrace my steps. That is when I saw the next headstone appear. It rose from the ground silently, impossibly fast, its surface wet and glimmering in the lantern light. I recognized the name immediately. It was a woman from town I had spoken to only that afternoon. The date was blank, but the inevitability of it weighed down on me. I could feel the cemetery's expectation in the cold wind brushing my face, in the faint tremor of the earth beneath my feet. I remembered the caretaker's warning. Names appear before the dead come. Those who see them are bound to the cemetery. I swallowed hard. Seeing the name had bound me further. I was no longer just an observer. I was a participant in its pattern, a piece in the slow, deliberate calculations of Marrow Hill. Every glance, every step, every decision mattered. The rules were not for guidance. They were for survival. As the night deepened, I continued my rounds, following the paths with meticulous care. The shadows twisted around me, the whispers rose and fell, and the cemetery continued to rearrange itself, subtle precision. The headstones shifted, new ones appeared, and I began to notice connections between them. Names that appeared together often shared a subtle relationship, a hidden thread that the cemetery seemed to know. I realized that it was not random. Every stone, every shadow, every whisper was part of a greater design, a map that only the cemetery fully understood. By the time I returned to the office near dawn, my hands were trembling. I set down the notebook, lantern flickering weakly. The rules were no longer abstract instructions. They were lifeline. I understood now that I was walking a fine line between life and death, obedience and punishment. The cemetery had claimed me as its watcher, and every night, every step, every shadow reminded me that it would not tolerate mistakes. I took a deep breath and prepared for another night. The rules were many, and the cemetery's patience infinite, but I knew I would need to obey every one if I wanted to survive. Every stone, every whisper, every shadow was a reminder, that the living and the dead were entwined here, bound by rules older than memory itself. The following night began with a thick fog rolling in before sundown, blanketing Marrow Hill in pale gray. The trees at the edge of the grounds looked like skeletons reaching from another world, their twisted arms brushing the mist. When I unlocked the gate, the padlock clicked louder than usual, echoing through the quiet like a warning. The air was still, unnaturally so, as though the world itself was holding its breath for what the night might bring. As soon as I stepped past the threshold, I sensed a change. The ground was damp, softer beneath my boots. The mist clung to the graves like a living thing, moving with the faintest suggestion of rhythm. I followed the lantern light, careful to avoid looking directly at the shifting fog, for the notebook had added a new rule since the night before. The writing had not been there when I last checked, yet it appeared in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of writing it. If the fog moves against the wind, do not acknowledge it. It unsettled me deeply. The cemetery was evolving, rewriting its own rules, or perhaps using me to do it. I pressed on, following the path, toward the newer section of graves. There the stones were clean, recently carved, the inscriptions sharp and unmarred by time. I passed the row of military burials, the ones I always greeted with a small nod, as the caretaker had advised. It was said those souls were restless, not from guilt, but from confusion. Men who never truly understood the wars they fought. Halfway through the section, my lantern flickered. For a moment, everything went dark, and I heard movement in the distance, soft, deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps pacing between graves. I relit the flame with trembling hands, and that's when I noticed it. Another headstone that hadn't been there before. The earth around it was still unsettled, and the soil freshly turned. I approached slowly, heart pounding, and when I brushed the fog aside, the name carved into the marble made my stomach twist. It was mine. I froze, staring at it, my breath fogging the air. The letters were perfectly engraved, no date beneath the name, just empty space waiting to be filled. The cemetery had marked me. I remembered the caretaker's warning. Seeing the names was dangerous, but when the ground itself called your name, the end was already in motion. Still, I couldn't look away. My hand reached out before I could stop it, fingers brushing the cold stone surface. Immediately, a sound rippled through the air, a low, mournful hum that seemed to come from beneath the earth. The ground quivered gently under my boots, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the lantern. Whispered voices rose around me, urgent and pleading, speaking too many words at once to understand. The sound was overwhelming, echoing inside my skull, until one phrase emerged clearly from the chaos. Follow the rules. I turned and ran, barely thinking, retracing the path toward the caretaker's office. My breath came fast and ragged, the fog swirling thicker with every step. Somewhere behind me, something followed. I could hear it not in heavy footfalls, but in the rhythm of the whispers that matched my own pace. I didn't dare look back. Every rule I'd read echoed in my head like a mantra. Keep to the path. Don't look behind you. Do not acknowledge the moving fog. When I reached the office, the air was colder than outside. The lantern flame flickered violently, and the notebook sat open on the desk, its pages turning on their own. I stepped closer, heart hammering, and the movement stopped. A new rule had appeared, written again in my hand. If your name appears on a stone, you are no longer the only one keeping watch. I stared at it for a long time, unable to breathe. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, blotting out the moonlight. The hum beneath the ground faded, leaving only silence, heavy and expectant. I realized then that my patrols were no longer about keeping the peace or deterring vandals. The cemetery had chosen me, not as a protector, but as a participant. The rules were not meant to protect me from it. They were meant to protect it from me. When dawn came, the fog lifted slowly, reluctant to leave. My name was gone from the headstone. The earth had smoothed itself over as though it had never been disturbed. But I knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting. Each night the cemetery gave something back to the earth and took something else in return, a memory, a moment, a piece of who I was. I could feel it still, like a slow erosion of self. As I prepared for the next night, I copied the rules onto a separate sheet, just to make sense of them all. There were now 12 in total, some crossed out, others rewritten in different handwriting. The final one stood alone at the bottom of the page, written in a faint gray ink that shimmered faintly under light. When the cemetery learns your name, the watch never ends. I sat there in silence, watching the ink pulse as if alive, realizing that perhaps the dead were not the only ones bound to this place. That night, I left the office later than usual, lantern swinging at my side. The cemetery was unusually quiet, but the stillness was deceptive. Marrow Hill had a rhythm of its own, and any interruption to it, any hesitation on my part, could summon consequences that were impossible to predict. The fog had returned, thicker this time, curling along the ground like a living thing. I followed the paths carefully, counting each step, avoiding the same spaces twice, reciting the rules silently in my mind to steady myself. As I moved through the older section of the graveyard, I noticed that the shadows were different. They didn't stretch from the moonlight. They shifted independently, creeping along paths and sliding across tombstones, sometimes lingering in corners where no lantern light reached. The whispers returned, low and persistent, calling names I recognized and names I did not. One name cut through the chorus with unmistakable clarity, my own. I stopped, gripping the lantern tightly, trying to locate the source. Nothing moved except the shadows curling like smoke over the cold earth. Then I felt it, a presence behind me, deliberate and unyielding. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Yet the sensation of being watched was suffocating. The rules flashed in my mind. Do not retrace your steps. Do not follow your shadow. Do not disturb the stones. I realized with a chill that I had broken one just by turning too quickly, and a cold fear settled over me, heavier than anything I had ever felt. I pressed on, approaching a cluster of headstones near the center of the cemetery. Here the earth seemed unnaturally dark, almost black, and the fog thickened around me as if it had a mind of its own. That's when I saw it, a figure standing motionless between two graves. Taller than any man should be, shrouded in darkness, featureless, yet somehow unmistakably human. I knew instinctively not to approach. I remembered another rule. If you see a watcher, do not engage. But my curiosity, my terror, demanded I see more. The figure shifted slightly, a subtle motion, but enough to make my heart pound. The whispers intensified, layering over one another until they became a tidal wave of sound. Names, dates, warnings, commands, they all crashed into my mind at once. I staggered back, my lantern swinging wildly, casting fractured beams of light that illuminated the figure for only a moment before it dissolved into the shadow again. A new headstone had appeared while I wasn't looking. Its surface glimmered as if wet, its letters freshly carved. I recognized the name immediately. Someone I had seen only that afternoon, alive and laughing, now marked as though the cemetery had claimed them before fate itself could catch up. My breath caught, and my hand trembled as I approached the stone. The date was still blank, but I felt the inevitability in the air, heavy and suffocating. The cemetery's memory stretched forward beyond the living, predicting what must come. The shadows thickened, wrapping around me like tendrils, and the whispers formed words I could barely make sense of. Follow the rules. Do not interfere. The living are fragile here. I realized then that the cemetery was teaching me. Each headstone, each shadow, each movement of the fog was a lesson in obedience, a warning that survival depended entirely on understanding its rules and never straying from them. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time no longer mattered here. I returned to the office again, my body exhausted, hands shaking, lantern weak. The notebook lay open on the desk, blank pages now filled with new rules, some in familiar handwriting, others in a script I didn't recognize. The final one was etched faintly across the bottom of the last page. The living are temporary. The watch is eternal. Learn the rules or join the stones. I understood then that I was no longer merely a night watchman. I had become part of the cemetery's calculation, a participant in its eternal vigilance. Every shadow, every whisper, every freshly carved name reminded me that my duty was no longer optional. I could not leave. The cemetery would not allow it. As dawn approached, the fog thinned slightly, retreating reluctantly, revealing the graves in pale, cold light. I looked at the paths I had traveled, memorized their twists and turns, and felt the weight of countless names waiting to appear. I knew that tonight had been just the beginning. There would be more shadows, more whispers, more headstones rising from the soil. I sat at the desk, lantern flickering, notebook in hand, silently repeating the rules over and over. Each one was a thread holding me to the living world, fragile yet vital. I realized with a sinking certainty that Marrow Hill Cemetery did not simply remember the dead. It remembered everything. Every movement, every thought, every misstep was recorded in the stones, and as its watchman, I would be bound to those rules for as long as the cemetery demanded. Never free, never safe. Always learning, always watching, always obeying. It began with the sound of chiseling. A faint, rhythmic tapping that broke the silence of the cemetery long after midnight. Was subtle at first, so soft I thought it might be the wind brushing against loose gravel or the shifting branches above. But as I stopped to listen, I realized it was coming from deeper within the graveyard, steady, deliberate, and unmistakably human. I followed the sound carefully, lantern swaying, its glow cutting through the mist like a knife. Each strike echoed in the distance, growing sharper the closer I came. The rules didn't mention anything about hearing work being done after dark, but I had learned by now that the absence of a rule didn't mean safety. It often meant something unspoken, something the cemetery hadn't yet revealed. As I turned down the narrow path leading to the oldest section of Marrow Hill, the air grew heavier. The graves here were worn and leaning, names eroded by rain and time. Yet I could still make out faint outlines of letters, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let them go. The tapping stopped abruptly. In its place came a soft scrape, the unmistakable sound of stone being carved. I held the lantern high, and that's when I saw it. A man stood hunched over a headstone, his back to me, dressed in what looked like an old caretaker's coat, the kind I had seen the photographs inside the office. His shoulders moved with precise rhythm, each motion slow, patient, intentional. His hand worked a small chisel into the surface of the marble, cutting letters with calm precision. The glow of the lantern revealed something else he was carving into a stone that was already complete. There was a name on it, faint but visible, and below it, he was adding another. I wanted to call out to ask what he was doing there, but something in the air held me still. The fog swirled around him as though obeying his movements, and when he paused, it paused too. He wiped his hand across the surface, stepped back, and for a moment, the mist thinned enough for me to read the inscription. My breath caught in my throat. The name on the stone was one I had seen the night before. A woman from town, alive, breathing, unaware of what waited for her. The caretaker leaned close again, carving the date of her death. Not today's date, not tomorrow's, but soon. I tried to step back quietly, but the ground beneath my boots betrayed me with a sharp crunch of gravel. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the cemetery had been waiting for it. The man froze. His chisel stilled mid-air. Then slowly, he turned his head toward me. His face was pale, almost translucent. The lines of age etched deep into features that seemed impossibly still. His eyes were hollow yet aware, filled with something both exhausted and eternal. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, holding the chisel loosely in one trembling hand. Then he lifted his other hand and pointed toward the stone. "Names must be kept," he said finally, his voice dry as the earth itself. "The stones remember what the living forget." I didn't move. His words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and unshakable. He turned back to the headstone and finished the final mark of the date. The sound of the chisel against stone echoed like a heartbeat, steady and slow. When he was done, he brushed the dust away with his sleeve and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then, without warning, he began to fade. His form grew faint, his coat dissolving into the mist, until only the chisel remained, falling silently to the ground. I stepped closer, trembling, and looked down at the stone again. The inscription was flawless, the letters so precise they seemed machine-cut. But there was something else now, a faint shimmer beneath the carved name, as though the stone had absorbed the glow of the lantern itself. I reached out to touch it, and for a brief moment, I felt warmth not from life, but from presence. The stone was alive with memory. When I withdrew my hand, I found that some of the dust from the carving had stuck to my skin. It wasn't ordinary stone dust. It glimmered faintly under the light, silver and cold. The notebook in my pocket felt heavier suddenly, and when I opened it, a new line had appeared in jagged writing. "Do not touch fresh names. They belong to the dead before the living do." I closed the book quickly, heart racing. The cemetery was not only predicting deaths, now it was assigning them, etching them into permanence long before fate could intervene. The stones were keeping their own records, preserving futures as though they were already memories. As I looked around, I realized with dread that nearly every grave in the section bore faint, unfinished carvings. Names half-formed, letters waiting to be completed. The cemetery wasn't waiting for the dead. It was preparing for them. And somewhere within its endless ledger of names, I knew mine would be carved again. Not as a mistake, but as a reminder. The longer I stayed among the graves, the more I began to notice patterns in the names that appeared. They were never random. Families were grouped together. Friends were marked in clusters. And sometimes I saw connections I couldn't explain, people I had never met, appearing on stones next to those I knew intimately. The cemetery seemed to understand relationships, histories, even secrets that the living had tried to bury along with their dead. I moved slowly down the path, careful not to disturb the earth or retrace my steps. Every few paces, another headstone shimmered faintly, the names on it growing sharper in the lantern light. Some names were familiar, some were strangers, but all carried the weight of inevitability. Each time a new name appeared, the whispers rose around me, soft at first, then building into a chorus of murmurs, half voices, half warnings. One stone in particular caught my attention. It was small and simple, with a fresh layer of dirt around its base. The name carved into it belonged to a child who had disappeared from the town years ago, a case long closed and forgotten by everyone except the family. Yet here, the cemetery had remembered. The date of death had been left blank, but the letters themselves seemed to pulse softly, vibrating in tune with the faint whispers that filled the night. I knelt by the grave, feeling a pull in my chest, a compulsion to trace the letters with my fingers. The notebook's rule echoed in my mind. Do not touch fresh names. They belong to the dead before the living do. I forced myself to look away, but the pull didn't stop. It It was magnetic, drawing me closer with an urgency I could not resist. I realized then that the stones were more than just markers. They were vessels, conduits between what was and what would be. Each name carved into the marble carried intention, memory, and inevitability. As I continued my patrol, I noticed that some of the headstones began to change after I passed. Names I had memorized shifted slightly in alignment, dates subtly updated. The cemetery was not static. It responded to observation, to my presence, to the paths I chose to follow. The rules were not just about safety. They were instructions for interacting with a living record, a ledger of souls that expanded and adapted with every passing night. By the time I reached the northern edge of the cemetery, the whispers had grown into words I could almost understand. They were warnings, advice, and reminders all at once. Names must be observed, never altered. Respect the order, or become part of the record. I felt the weight of those words pressing against my chest, heavy and impossible to ignore. The cemetery was not merely keeping watch. It was demanding vigilance, demanding obedience, and reminding me that every misstep could carry consequences far beyond my comprehension. A sudden chill swept through the area, and I realized the fog had thickened again, curling around the graves like silent sentinels. Shapes moved within it, dark and indistinct, brushing the edges of the lantern light. I felt eyes upon me, countless and patient. Somewhere in the distance, a faint tapping resumed, chiseling, insistent, methodical. I knew instinctively that the stone was being prepared again, names waiting to be written, futures being recorded before they unfolded. I continued walking, careful to follow the established paths and avoid retracing steps. Even with caution, I could feel the cemetery testing me, nudging me, ensuring I was aware of every name, every shadow, every whispered syllable. The responsibility of observing the names weighed on me, pressing into my mind like the very stones themselves. Each name was a life, a fate, and I, the night watchman, was entrusted to witness it without interference. Hours passed in quiet, tense vigilance. I paused at each headstone, reading names, observing dates, and noting changes in the dust. The shimmer of fresh carvings, the subtle vibrations that signaled the cemetery's attention. I understood then that the stones themselves were alive in a way that transcended memory and time. They were not merely markers. They were records, guides, warnings, and sentinels. And in that night, I realized that every name on a stone, every fresh carving, every whisper of inevitability was a thread in the vast, unbroken ledger that the cemetery maintained with infinite patience and precision. The nights at Marrow Hill began to feel longer than they should. I would arrive at the cemetery in the evening, lantern in hand, and before I had even passed the gates, I could sense the pulse of the stones beneath the earth. Each grave was no longer just a marker of what had been, but a whisper of what was yet to come. The names carved into the marble carried weight, intent, and inevitability. And I, the watchman, was the only one who could bear witness without succumbing to the pull of their power. One night I came across a row of stones that chilled me to my core. They were arranged in perfect alignment, each stone freshly carved, letters shining as if still wet. I recognized some of the names immediately, townspeople I had met during the day, alive and well, unaware of what the cemetery had already decreed. Others were strangers, distant names whose significance I could not yet understand. But all were connected in a way I could feel rather than see, as though invisible threads tied them together beneath the fog and earth. As I approached, the whispers began, low at first, then rising like a tide. Each name was spoken, softly, reverently, as though the cemetery itself was chanting a prayer. My own name was among them, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. The rule echoed in my mind: do not touch fresh names. They belong to the dead before the living do. I forced myself to step carefully, keeping my fingers to myself, though the stones seemed to hum under my gaze. I stopped at one headstone in particular. It bore the name of a woman from town, alive, laughing, unaware of the future etched into stone. The date of her death had not been carved yet, but the outline of it was visible, almost imperceptible, beneath the polished marble. I felt a tug at the edge of my mind, a pull toward the inevitable, and I forced myself to look away. I had learned the hard way that acknowledgement alone could bind me closer to the cemetery's will. The shadows shifted around me, thickening, stretching toward the stones like liquid darkness. Shapes moved in the fog, unformed but watchful, hovering just beyond the lantern light. One of them emerged fully, a figure hunched over a fresh grave, chisel in hand. I recognized the form immediately. The old caretaker I had seen before, now working tirelessly under the dim glow. Each strike of the chisel rang out in the silence, precise and deliberate, carving letters that had not yet existed. I dared not approach. The rule was clear. Do not interfere with the carving of names. Yet the pull of curiosity gnawed at me. I watched as he finished one name and began the next. Faint dust rising from the stone, catching in the lantern's light. The letters seemed to shimmer as they took form, vibrating faintly, alive with memory and inevitability. The whispers rose, swelling into a chorus that enveloped me, reciting names I did not recognize and futures I could not comprehend. I realized then that the cemetery was not merely a resting place. It was a ledger of life and death, a chronicle that spanned beyond human memory. Each name was a story, a path, a fate. The stones remembered what the living could not. They remembered the unspoken, the hidden, the inevitable. I understood with a deep and terrifying clarity that my role was not simply to watch, but to learn, to navigate, to obey, so that I might survive in a place where survival was not guaranteed. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time had no meaning here. The fog thickened and thinned, shadows danced, and the whispers never ceased. I moved carefully from stone to stone, reading names, memorizing details, and noting the subtle shifts in the earth. I began to see patterns, families clustered together, strangers aligned in sequences that suggested knowledge beyond my understanding. The cemetery was intentional in its order, deliberate in its design, and I was only beginning to comprehend the magnitude of its awareness. By the end of the night, I returned to the office, lantern dim and hands trembling. The notebook lay open, new lines etched into the pages and handwriting that was both mine and not mine. Rules I had never seen before now appeared. Observe without touching. Respect the sequence. Record nothing outside the ledger. I closed the book, heart pounding, and realized that I could never truly leave this place. Each name carved into the stones was a reminder that the cemetery had memory, purpose, and patience beyond human comprehension. As dawn broke, the mist receded slightly, and I looked back at the graves one last time. The names glimmered faintly in the pale light, each one a testament to inevitability. I knew that the night would come again, and with it, more names, more whispers, and more shadows. The stones waited patiently for my return, and I understood with a heavy certainty that Marrow Hill was no ordinary cemetery. It was alive, aware, and eternal, and I had become its witness, bound to the rhythm of its names and the weight of its rules. The nights blurred together after that. Each evening, I arrived at Marrow Hill Cemetery with the same sense of dread and anticipation, knowing that the stones had recorded another layer of reality while I was away. Each headstone, whether weathered and ancient or freshly carved, carried intent. Each name was a story already written, a life meticulously cataloged by the cemetery before the world even knew it had ended. I began to understand that seeing a name was more than observation. It was acknowledgement. a participation in the cemetery's eternal memory. One night, as I made my rounds along the southern path, I noticed a cluster of stones that seemed different from the rest. They glimmered faintly, almost like they were polished, though I knew that no one had been there to clean them. As I approached, the whispers intensified, a soft, undulating chant of names, some familiar, some foreign. The air was thick, pressing against my skin with a subtle insistence, urging me to look closer. The stones before me began to change. Names that had been etched faintly in the past now appeared solid, dates filling themselves in, letters sharpening in the dim lantern light. I felt a compulsion to reach out, to trace the words with my fingers, but I remembered the rules. Do not touch fresh names. They belong to the dead before the living do. I resisted, yet the pull was strong. The cemetery seemed to hum beneath my feet, alive with the weight of what had been written and what was yet to come. I noticed one headstone in particular. It bore the name of a child who had vanished from the town many years ago, a case long closed and largely forgotten. The letters glowed faintly in the lantern light, the edges vibrating as if aware of my gaze. I could see the outline of the date, not yet carved, but inevitable. The whispers coalesced into a single, resonant phrase. The living cannot escape the memory of the dead. As I stepped back, shadows moved across the path. They were not cast by the moon or the lantern. They were independent, twisting and curling toward the stones like living tendrils. From within them I could sense presence, patient and watchful, neither malevolent nor kind, simply eternal. I realized that the cemetery was observing me as closely as I observed it. Every glance, every hesitation, every misstep was noted. The rules were not suggestions. They were the boundaries of survival within this living ledger of names. Then I saw it, a fresh stone rising silently from the earth. The soil around it shifted as if breathing, a thin wisp of fog curling over the polished surface. I could see the letters forming, though no one was present to carve them. The name belonged to a man from town I had spoken to only that afternoon. Alive, oblivious, unaware that his fate had already been recorded. The date was blank, yet the inevitability of it pressed against me like a weight. I felt the familiar tug at my chest, the magnetic pull to step closer, to acknowledge it fully. The whispers surrounded me, layering names upon names, lives intertwining in patterns too complex to discern. I realized with a chill certainty that the cemetery was more than a resting place. It was a ledger that extended beyond time and space, cataloging life and death in meticulous detail. I understood that my role was not merely to observe, but to bear witness, to navigate the endless cycle of names without becoming part of the record myself. Hours passed in tense, silent observation. I moved from stone to stone, careful to follow the paths exactly, careful to keep my eyes on the lantern's glow and not on the shifting shadows. Names continued to appear, the air vibrating with inevitability, a constant reminder that the cemetery's memory was precise and unyielding. Each name was a thread in an invisible web, connecting the living and the dead, the past and the future, in ways I could not yet comprehend. Only, by the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I was exhausted. Lantern dim, hands trembling, I returned to the caretaker's office. The notebook lay open, pages filled with new lines of rules I had never seen before. Observe without interference. Remember the names. Do not allow your own to slip into forgetfulness. I closed it slowly, understanding that the names on the stones were not merely markers of death, but conduits, vessels of inevitability, and that my duty was now inseparable from the cemetery itself. I looked back once at the rows of graves glimmering faintly in the pale morning light. The names waited, patient and eternal. The cemetery had claimed me as a witness, and I understood that each night would bring new names, new whispers, and new shadows. The stones would continue to remember, and I would continue to watch, bound by rules older than memory, and a ledger that extended beyond life itself. The presence began as a shadow at the edge of my vision. At first I thought it was a trick of the lantern light, a trick of my tired mind, but it grew clearer with every night I spent patrolling Marrow Hill Cemetery. There was a figure that moved between the graves, never rushing, never stopping, but always watching. I could feel it, even when I couldn't see it clearly, a constant awareness brushing against the edges of my thoughts, reminding me that I was never alone. I had come to understand that the cemetery itself was alive, its stones recording inevitabilities, its fog shifting like water around unseen obstacles. But this watcher was different. It was not part of the earth, nor the mist, nor the whispering voices that filled the night air. It moved with intent, deliberate and measured, threading its way through the graves like a needle through the fabric. Whenever I paused, it paused. Whenever I moved, it adjusted its path, always maintaining a distance that was close enough to be felt, but far enough to remain elusive. One night, as I approached the central mausoleum, the fog had thickened to a curtain around the older graves. Lantern held high, I noticed the watcher standing between two leaning headstones, its silhouette tall and narrow. It did not shift, it did not breathe, yet its presence was undeniable. I could feel it measuring me, judging my adherence to the rules, assessing whether I understood my place among the living in a place ruled by the dead. I tried to meet its gaze, but its face was featureless, a smooth surface like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but shadow. I remembered the rules in the notebook, the ones that had appeared without explanation over the past nights. Do not engage the watcher. Do not follow. Do not flee. I swallowed hard and moved past, careful to keep my steps precise, not to retrace any path. My lantern casting light only where necessary. The watcher moved in perfect synchronization, maintaining its distance, sliding between the graves as if it were a shadow given form, a guardian of the spaces between life and death. Each night I learned a little more about its patterns. The watcher seemed drawn to names freshly carved into the stones, lingering near them as if marking them in its memory. Sometimes it appeared near graves where the earth was unsettled, where new stones had risen silently while I patrolled elsewhere. I came to understand that it was not malevolent in the way a haunting might be, but it was exacting, relentless, and precise. Its purpose was not revenge or anger. It was vigilance, a force of observation within the already watchful cemetery. One evening, as the moon rose high and the fog lay thick across the paths, I noticed the watcher nearer than usual. Its shadow stretched unnaturally across the earth, linking two headstones like a bridge. I could see subtle movements within its form, slight undulations, as though it breathed without a chest, flexed without bones. The whispers in the cemetery grew louder in response to its presence, voices weaving through the fog, repeating names, dates, and warnings, layering the night with a weight I could not escape. I felt my chest tighten as I realized that the watcher did not simply patrol the graves. It seemed to patrol the spaces between them. The rules I had memorized suddenly took on a deeper meaning. The paths were not just guidelines for safety, they were boundaries, lines I was not allowed to cross without acknowledgement. The watcher existed in the gaps, the spaces the living could never fully occupy. It was a guardian of inevitability, a sentinel ensuring that the living never became careless among the records of the dead. As I continued along the eastern path, I noticed small disturbances in the soil, places where a grave had shifted slightly or a stone had moved out of alignment. The watcher paused near each one, remaining still until the subtle changes were recorded, until the cemetery itself seemed to settle. It was patient, deliberate, unyielding. I understood then that its presence was a reflection of the cemetery's own sentience, an extension of the rules and the ledger that existed in stone and earth. I reached a clearing near the older section where several ancient graves leaned precariously. The watcher moved silently between them, tracing paths invisible to my eyes, its featureless face turning slowly toward each stone as if inspecting them for errors, for imperfections, for anything that might disrupt the order of memory. I felt an instinctive urge to step closer, to study it, to understand it. But the rules flashed through my mind like warnings burned in fire. Do not engage the watcher. Do not interfere. Do not be seen following. I lowered my gaze and continued my patrol, careful to maintain my route. My heart pounded as I felt its awareness brush against me, a presence that could sense every hesitation, every misstep, every thought I could not contain. And yet, even as fear pressed against me, a strange certainty emerged. I was not being hunted. I was being observed, tested, taught. The watcher existed, to maintain order between the living and the dead, a bridge between the inevitabilities carved into stone and the fragile, fleeting presence of those still breathing. The longer I patrolled, the more I noticed the watcher's patterns. It did not wander aimlessly. It moved with purpose, threading between the graves with an understanding of the cemetery's hidden order. Sometimes it would pause at a fresh headstone, tilting its featureless head toward the letters as if committing them to memory. Other times it would glide past older graves, lingering for only a heartbeat before slipping into the fog. I realized that it did not simply observe the living, it monitored the dead as well, ensuring that their names, their stories, their inevitabilities remained intact. One particularly fog-heavy night, I found myself near a cluster of graves that had shifted overnight. The earth was disturbed, fresh soil uneven around the bases of the headstones. I knew instinctively that the watcher was near before I saw it, a presence felt rather than seen. Its shadow stretched across the graves, connecting them in ways that were almost geometrical, precise. The whispers of the cemetery rose and fell in response to its movements, a chorus that spoke of names and dates, warnings and inevitabilities, all interwoven in a pattern I could only begin to understand. I followed the path cautiously, careful to keep my lantern light steady and my steps deliberate. Each time I glanced at the watcher, I felt a cold pressure in my chest, a subtle insistence that I acknowledge its presence without engaging. It moved like a shadow with intent, bridging the spaces between graves, patrolling the invisible lines the cemetery required. I understood then that these paths, these spaces, were not merely physical. They were boundaries of safety, of survival. One misstep, one thoughtless movement, and I could disrupt the delicate balance the watcher maintained. The watcher paused at a particularly ancient grave, leaning so far it seemed it might topple at any moment. Its head tilted slightly, and for a brief instant, I thought I saw faint traces of light beneath its smooth, featureless surface. Not reflection, not shadow, but a shimmer, like memory itself made visible. The whispers rose to a crescendo, names layering upon names, dates of birth and death merging into a soft, almost melodic chant. I realized that the watcher was not just recording what had been or what would be. It was reinforcing the memory of the dead, reminding the cemetery of its own ledger, ensuring nothing slipped into forgetfulness. I stepped carefully along the path, mindful of the rules. Do not engage, do not follow, do not flee. I understood now that fleeing could draw attention, following could bind me to the watcher's own rhythm, and engagement could be disastrous. The cemetery was patient, eternal, and indifferent to human fear. The watcher was its agent, neither cruel nor kind, merely absolute in its duty. Each night I learned to move with awareness, to respect the spaces it occupied, and to navigate the living boundaries it enforced between the graves. Then something unexpected occurred. The watcher stopped mid-stride, hovering between two headstones I had passed countless times before. It turned slowly, featureless face directed toward me, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming pull in the air, a connection, almost like a tether linking my heartbeat to its presence. The whisper surged, urgent yet incomprehensible, and a single rule formed in my mind, unspoken but undeniable. You are part of the space between graves now. I froze, lantern light trembling in my hand. The watcher remained still for several long, impossible moments, and then, without warning, it moved again, gliding past me toward the eastern section of the cemetery. I followed cautiously, careful not to break the rule, careful not to let curiosity overcome caution. I realized that the watcher did not invite interaction. It tolerated observation, but it demanded respect. As I continued, the night deepened and the fog thickened, curling around the headstones like living tendrils. Shadows seemed to shift independently, brushing against the lantern light in fleeting glimpses. The watcher moved fluidly between them, tracing paths invisible to my eyes, connecting stones and souls with an authority that was absolute. I understood that the cemetery itself was alive not only in memory but in intent. It had assigned this watcher as its sentinel, ensuring that every name, every story, every inevitability remained unbroken. By the time I returned to the caretaker's office before dawn, I was exhausted, my mind racing with the patterns I had observed. The watcher had not spoken, had not acted aggressively, yet its presence had left an indelible mark on my understanding. The rules, the whispers, the stones themselves, they were all part of a system far beyond human comprehension, and I was now deeply entwined within it, a witness not only to the dead, but to the sentinel that ensured their memory endured. As the nights wore on, the watcher became more than an observer to me. It became a measure of my own presence within the cemetery. I could sense its awareness as surely as I could feel the cold damp of the fog or the uneven soil beneath my boots. It did not simply move among the graves. It communicated without sound, issuing warnings, subtle shifts in air, a weight in the shadows, a pressure in the spaces I occupied. I began to anticipate its movements, to trace its invisible lines, and in doing so, learn to navigate Marrow Hill with a precision I had never known. The watcher's routines were methodical yet unpredictable. Some nights it would linger near the older graves, seemingly ensuring that their names remained intact in memory and stone. Other nights it would glide past the freshly carved stones, pausing only long enough to let the whispers rise and fall in recognition. It became clear that the watcher was not limited by time in the way humans are. It existed outside it, moving with a patience that was infinite, attending to names, dates, and inevitabilities with unwavering attention. One evening, as a particularly thick fog swallowed the eastern section of the cemetery, I noticed a shift in its behavior. It lingered near a grave that had not been disturbed for decades, one of the oldest in the cemetery, leaning and cracked with age. Its head tilted slightly, and for the first time, I saw faint, almost imperceptible movements within its featureless surface, like ripples on dark water. I realized that this was not simply observation. This was maintenance, an active preservation of the memory embedded in the stone. I approached cautiously, keeping my distance, careful not to break the rules that had become second nature. Do not engage, do not follow, do not flee. The whispers swelled around me, speaking names, reciting dates, layering the air with histories I had no hope of fully comprehending. The watcher moved slowly between the graves, bridging the spaces, its presence a living thread connecting the past, present, and inevitable future. I understood then that it was not merely a sentinel of the cemetery, it was a conductor of memory, ensuring that the stories of the dead were neither lost nor disrupted by the living. Suddenly the watcher paused and turned toward me, tilting its head in a manner that suggested awareness of my own heartbeat and intent. The air thickened, and I felt a pull at the edges of my consciousness, subtle but insistent. It was a warning, not spoken, but felt in the marrow of my bones. Your presence is noted. Your path must not disturb the order. I froze, lantern light quivering in my hand, and watched as it moved again, slipping between the graves like smoke, vanishing into the fog without a sound. That night, the experience left a lasting impression. I realized that the Watcher existed in the gaps, the liminal spaces between stone and soil, between life and death. It was the embodiment of the cemetery's rules, a living agent enforcing the order of inevitability. The whispers, the fog, the shifting shadows, all of it was part of its domain. Every night it measured, tested, and corrected, ensuring that every name, every story, every carved letter remained intact and respected. Over time, I began to see subtle patterns in its patrol. The Watcher would pause briefly at graves where names had recently appeared, as though acknowledging the inevitability inscribed there. It would linger near stones where the earth had shifted unexpectedly, correcting the disturbance in ways I could not perceive. And always it moved through the spaces between, a silent reminder that the living must remain in the paths prescribed, must respect the gaps where memory and inevitability intersect. On one particular night, I noticed a small cluster of fresh graves where the Watcher hesitated longer than usual. The fog thickened, curling around the stones like a living thing, and I felt a strange pressure in the air, heavy with expectation. The whispers rose in a chorus, urgent but indecipherable, and I understood that the Watcher was guiding something into place, shaping the space between the graves, reinforcing the boundaries that the living were forbidden to cross. By the time I returned to the office, hours later, the lantern's light weak and my body exhausted. The experience had etched itself into my understanding. The Watcher was not a mere guardian. It was the embodiment of the cemetery's will, its presence a living manifestation of order, memory, and inevitability. I realized that my role as night watchman was now inseparable from its patrol. The Watcher ensured that I understood my place, that I followed the rules, that I respected the spaces between names. In doing so, I survived. Deviate from its vigilance, and I would become just another name, another inevitability, recorded silently in stone by the cemetery itself. After that night, I could never see the cemetery the same way again. Every shadow, every glimmer of fog, every whisper of the wind seemed infused with the Watcher's presence. It was not just moving through the graves. It was moving through time itself, patrolling the thin line between what had been and what was to come. I could feel it in the marrow of my bones, an unrelenting awareness that reminded me that nothing here was random, nothing left unobserved. I began to notice small, almost imperceptible signs of its attention. Freshly disturbed soil would settle in patterns that mirrored its movements. Dust on older stones shifted subtly as if brushed by invisible hands. The whispers of names I had read before sometimes returned, now faintly altered, as though the Watcher was reminding me that the cemetery was alive with memory, and every living observer must pay careful heed. One night, while walking the narrow path near the oldest crypts, I saw the Watcher clearly for the first time. It had paused at a grave whose stone had cracked decades ago. Its form shimmered faintly, almost as if light were bending around it, and for a brief instant, I glimpsed the faintest traces of features beneath the featureless surface. Lines of eyes, nose, and mouth, blurred as if the memory of a human face was fading into shadow. Its head tilted toward me, and I felt a weight pressing down, a recognition, an acknowledgement of my place in this space. I understood that the Watcher did not act out of malice or fear. It did not punish. It enforced memory. It preserved the ledger of the dead with a patience and precision far beyond anything a human could comprehend. Each pause, each deliberate movement, each silent inspection of a grave was a lesson, a reminder that the names on the stones were sacred, unalterable, inevitable. Any interference, intentional or accidental, could ripple through the delicate order it maintained. One particular encounter remains seared in my memory. I had been tracking a newly carved grave, following the precise path I had memorized, when the Watcher suddenly appeared directly between me and the stone. I froze, lantern in hand, heart pounding. Its presence was immediate and oppressive, the fog thickening around it as if the night itself responded to its authority. The whispers intensified, forming patterns I could not understand, but their message was clear. Observe. Do not touch. Do not interfere. I realized then that the Watcher's vigilance extended beyond mere observation of the dead. It was teaching me, testing me, ensuring that I understood the importance of my role. Each night my awareness sharpened. My movements became more deliberate. My understanding of the cemetery's invisible boundaries more precise. I was learning to navigate not just the physical space, but the metaphysical one as well, threading between graves with care, respecting the Watcher's authority and the cemetery's memory. There were nights when the Watcher moved so close I could feel its presence in the air around me, a cold, subtle pressure that seemed to imprint itself on my mind. And yet, there was no malice, no threat, only the certainty that every step I took, every shadow I passed, every name I acknowledged mattered. I began to understand that the Watcher was a bridge, a guide between the living and the inevitabilities inscribed in stone. Without it, the rules would collapse, the ledger of names would fragment, and the balance between life and the cemetery's memory would be broken. By the final hours before dawn, the Watcher would retreat to its place among the older graves, fading into mist and shadow, leaving me alone with the stillness of the cemetery and the weight of its silence. Yet even then I could feel its attention lingering, like an imprint left on the air. It had taught me without words, disciplined me without force, and reminded me that the living were temporary observers in a world ruled by memory, inevitability, and stone. I began to accept that my nights at Marrow Hill were no longer about simple vigilance. They were about understanding, about learning the unspoken rules, about existing within the spaces the Watcher maintained. I realized that to survive, to continue as the night watchman, I had to honor its presence, respect its authority, and navigate the cemetery with the care of one who walks in a living ledger of inevitabilities. Each night, each shadow, each whisper reinforced the truth. The Watcher was eternal, the cemetery was alive, and I had become a part of a system far greater than myself, bound to observe, remember, and respect the spaces between graves for as long as I drew breath. Welcome to the deepest shadows of Marrow Hill, where the air itself seems weighted with memory and the earth hums softly with the lives it has absorbed. Over countless nights, I have come to understand that this cemetery does more than store the names of the dead. It remembers. Every stone, every mound of earth, every subtle whisper that drifts through the fog carries not just a name, but the essence of a life, preserved with a precision that defies human understanding. At first, I thought it was simply the result of the Watcher's vigilance, the sentinel who moved between graves, ensuring order and adherence to the rules. But I began to see that the cemetery itself had a consciousness, quiet but absolute, that extended beyond the Watcher. It was patient and eternal, and it recorded more than dates and names. It recorded moments, decisions, regrets, joys, and even the faintest hopes. It kept them safe, embedded in the stones, waiting for those who would come to witness, to remember, to acknowledge. One night I wandered into a section of the cemetery that I rarely patrolled. The fog was thick, curling like smoke around the older graves, and the whispers were louder here than anywhere else. They were layered, overlapping, like the echoes of countless lifetimes. As I walked slowly, I realized that some names I had never seen before shimmered faintly in the lantern light, their letters forming as if by their own volition. I could feel the lives behind the names brushing against the edges of my mind, not threatening, not intrusive, but insistent. The cemetery was speaking to me, and I understood that it would not forget anything. I knelt by a headstone that bore the name of someone who had died decades before I was born. The stone was worn and tilted, yet beneath the eroded surface I could sense traces of memory. A faint warmth radiated from the letters, subtle vibrations that told stories I could not fully grasp. It was as if the cemetery remembered the laughter of that person, the quiet moments of their life, the choices they had made, and even the lives they had touched. I felt both honored and overwhelmed. To be in such proximity to a memory so complete was humbling, and I realized that every grave, every stone carried this same weight. The watcher appeared then, as always, moving silently between the graves, ensuring that I did not overstep, that I observed but did not interfere. Its presence reminded me of the delicate balance that existed here. The cemetery preserved memory, but it also demanded respect. One careless act, one lapse in attention, and I could disrupt the ledger it maintained. I had learned to move with awareness, to step lightly, to observe without touching, and to read not just the stones, but the spaces between them. That night, I discovered a small cluster of graves that were unusually intact, despite their age. The stones glowed faintly in the lantern light, shimmering as though reflecting some hidden energy beneath the earth. I approached slowly, and as I did, I noticed that new names were appearing alongside the old ones, faint inscriptions etched by an invisible hand. Some were familiar from the town, alive yet unknowing that their names had already been claimed by the cemetery. Others were strangers, distant names whose stories I could only guess. The cemetery remembered them all, indifferent to familiarity or significance, recording each life with absolute precision. I traced my gaze over the stones, noting the patterns in their arrangement. Families were clustered together, sometimes spanning generations. Friends and strangers alike were aligned in sequences that suggested knowledge far beyond my comprehension. The cemetery was a living record, not merely of death, but of connections, of relationships, of the invisible threads that bound life to life and past to present. And in the center of this awareness was the watcher, ensuring that the memory remained unbroken, untarnished, eternal. The whispers swelled around me, names layering upon names, dates merging, stories blending into an unbroken narrative. I felt a strange sense of calm, tempered by awe. The cemetery was infinite in patience and scope. It remembered everything, and in its remembrance, it held a quiet, powerful justice. No life, no death, no choice or regret would be lost here. The stones and the earth themselves bore witness, preserving the essence of the living and the dead alike. Night after night, I came to understand the depth of the cemetery's memory. It was not just names on stones, dates in the ledger, or whispers in the fog. It was far more intricate, more complete than anything I had ever imagined. Each grave contained not only the record of a life lived, but also echoes of the choices, regrets, and violence that defined it. I began to notice subtleties that I had previously missed. The tilt of a stone, the way moss grew around a name, the shimmer of light across freshly disturbed earth. All of it was a language, a silent communication from the cemetery to anyone who knew how to read it. One evening I approached a row of graves that had long seemed ordinary to me. The fog was dense, curling like smoke, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. As I walked slowly among the markers, I felt the pull of memory emanating from one particular grave. It was a young woman's name, carved long ago, yet the letters glimmered faintly, alive with recollection. I could sense fragments of her life, the soft laughter she shared with friends, the quiet hours she spent writing in her journal, the fears she never voiced aloud. The cemetery had preserved it all, encoded it into the very stone, and held it with patience that spanned decades. The watcher moved silently between the graves, maintaining the order that the cemetery required. Its presence reminded me that even in this space of memory, rules were enforced. Observation alone was acceptable. Interference was not. I watched as it paused near a cracked headstone, its featureless face tilting slightly, and I felt a pressure in the air as if the cemetery itself acknowledged my understanding of the balance I was required to maintain. I realized that the cemetery did more than remember individual lives. It remembered connections. Families were meticulously grouped, friends' stones aligned, even distant strangers placed in arrangements that reflected invisible bonds I could not fully understand. The ledger it maintained was not linear. It was web-like, a network of lives, choices, and consequences woven together beneath the mist and earth. Each night, I followed its threads, careful to navigate paths that honored the order and respected the invisible lines that connected past, present, and inevitable future. Sometimes I noticed new names appearing quietly, without disturbance, without fanfare. They were etched into stones by forces I could not see, yet I understood their significance. These names were claims of inevitability, records that the cemetery had made long before the world outside had acknowledged them. The whispers around me grew stronger, layering over one another, forming patterns that were almost melodic, almost human, yet beyond comprehension. The watcher glided among them, ensuring the names remained intact, that no interruption broke the flow of memory. On nights like this, I would pause near a grave and close my eyes, letting the whispers fill my mind. I could feel the pulse of countless lives, intertwined and infinite, each one remembered, none forgotten. There was a strange comfort in this, a reassurance that even in death, life left an indelible mark. The cemetery did not judge, it did not take sides, it did not forget. It was impartial, absolute, eternal in its vigilance. And I, as the night watchman, became a small part of this system, a witness, a recorder, a protector of its memory. The more I walked among the graves, the more I understood that the cemetery's memory was alive, growing, adapting. New stones, new names, new lives were constantly integrated into its vast ledger, and the watcher, ever present, moved with it, maintaining the integrity of the system. I began to see my own reflection in this process. My vigilance mattered. My awareness mattered. To ignore the rules, to fail in observation, would be to risk erasure, not just of myself, but of the delicate order the cemetery upheld. The nights grew longer in my perception, though I knew it was the same passage of time. At Marrow Hill, hours seemed fluid, stretched by the weight of memory and the soft, persistent whispers of the dead. I began to recognize patterns, subtle yet undeniable. Some names shimmered faintly before fully appearing, as if the cemetery was preparing the record, testing my awareness. Others appeared fully formed but seemed to pulse with anticipation, carrying an urgency I could feel pressing against my chest. Each stone, each letter, each curve of the engraved script was a message, a story, a heartbeat frozen in time yet alive with presence. The watcher moved between these markers with a quiet authority. Its featureless form glided over paths invisible to me, pausing at graves in a rhythm I could not entirely predict. It was patient, eternal, and precise, never allowing a mistake to go unnoticed. Occasionally, its gaze, or what I perceived as its gaze, would sweep across me. In those moments, I felt both exposed and protected, aware of my place within the cemetery's meticulous order. My role was not to touch, not to interfere, not to intrude. I was a witness, a participant, only insofar as my awareness could honor the names and the memory preserved here. One night I found myself in the northern section of the cemetery where the oldest stones leaned precariously, worn by centuries of rain and wind. The fog here was thicker, the whispers louder, a chorus that seemed almost like voices, speaking a language I could almost understand. Names overlapped with one another, merging in subtle harmonics, creating layers of life and death, memory and inevitability. I knelt by one headstone, tracing the outline of the letters with my eyes. The cemetery whispered her story: birth, family, laughter, sorrow, all encoded in the stone. And then I realized that the watcher was there, gliding silently between the neighboring graves, ensuring the integrity of the narrative, ensuring that nothing of significance would be lost to time. As I moved along the narrow pathways, I began to notice connections between graves that I had never seen before. Families stretched across decades, their names linked by invisible threads that the cemetery preserved. Friends who had died young were placed near those who had passed much later, bound together by bonds unknown to the living. Even strangers were arranged in sequences that suggested stories I could not yet understand. The cemetery remembered everything: the trivial, the monumental, the forgotten, and the celebrated. Nothing was overlooked, and nothing was ever truly lost. I realized then that my own presence was woven into this web. Every step I took, every stone I observed, every whispered name I acknowledged, became part of the memory the cemetery maintained. The watcher's form moved between the graves, ensuring that I did not overstep, that I followed the invisible lines connecting lives past and present. Its vigilance was absolute, and yet it was not threatening. It existed to guide, to preserve, to maintain the delicate balance between what had been and what was yet to be acknowledged. On that night, I lingered near a particularly old and crumbling headstone, one that had leaned at a precarious angle for decades. The whispers were nearly deafening, a chorus of overlapping names, stories, and dates. As I listened, I felt the presence of lives long gone pressing against my consciousness, reminding me that memory here was absolute. The cemetery did not forget. It did not erode with time, and it did not distinguish between the living or the dead. Each life was recorded with precision, and the watcher ensured that order remained unbroken. I began to see the cemetery itself as a living entity, vast and patient, its consciousness threaded through every stone, every mound, every whisper in the night. It remembered indiscriminately, holding all lives with the same meticulous care. The watcher was its instrument, a silent, patient enforcer, ensuring that the stories carved into stone remained intact and undisturbed. And I, the night watchman, had become a part of this eternal system. My role was simple but profound: to witness, to respect, to navigate the spaces it preserved, and to understand that the cemetery remembered far more than I could ever fully grasp. As dawn approached, I paused on the edge of the eastern path, looking over rows of graves that seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog. The watcher retreated to its usual place among the older stones, fading slowly into shadow and mist. The whispers softened, leaving only the faint hum of memory that resonated through the air and earth. I understood then that Marrow Hill was not just a resting place. It was a living record, eternal and unyielding. It remembered everything, and through it, the past endured, untouched by time, preserved with an authority that even the living could not challenge. The final nights at Marrow Hill taught me more about memory than I ever thought possible. The cemetery does not merely preserve the dead, it preserves the echoes of life itself. Each name, each headstone, each carefully carved date is a testament not only to the inevitability of death, but to the totality of experience that preceded it. Laughter, sorrow, decisions, regrets, triumphs, all of it lives on here, encoded into stone, soil, and fog, endlessly observed and recorded. I began to realize that the cemetery does not forget, does not waver, and does not tire. Its memory stretches infinitely, embracing all who pass through its gates. The watcher remained at the center of this intricate balance. I observed it more closely during those nights, and I understood that its presence was not a threat, but a responsibility, a reminder that the living must honor what is already inscribed. It moved through the graves with deliberate care, bridging spaces between stones, ensuring the flow of memory remained undisturbed. The whispers around it rose and fell like a symphony, a chorus that could only be understood in fragments, yet one that carried the weight of countless lives. On one night, as the moonlight spilled through the fog, I came across a freshly carved grave that seemed to hum with particular intensity. Its letters glimmered faintly, alive with memory, even before anyone outside the cemetery knew the name. The watcher paused near it, hovering between adjacent stones as if ensuring that the space, the life, and the inevitability were perfectly aligned. I felt the pull of the memory, a soft tug at the edges of my awareness, and I understood that this cemetery remembers not only what is past, but also what is destined to come. I knelt by a cluster of older graves, observing how the watcher traced invisible paths between them. The soil, the stones, the moss, everything seemed connected in ways that were intricate and deliberate. Families, friends, and even strangers were linked by threads I could not see, yet the cemetery preserved them flawlessly. Here, no story is truly lost. Even lives long forgotten by the living are safeguarded in memory, honored in stone and soil, and carefully monitored by the eternal sentinel that ensures order persists. Through the nights, I began to feel a profound sense of reverence. I understood that my role was not merely to patrol, but to participate in the acknowledgement of life and death. Every careful step, every moment of still observation became a ritual of respect. The cemetery does not tolerate carelessness, yet it does not demand fear. It simply requires presence, awareness, and understanding of its infinite ledger. And the watcher enforces this, patient and absolute, a bridge between the living and the immovable memory of the dead. I saw patterns that deepened with each visit. The way newer graves were aligned with older ones, how names were clustered to reflect relationships and legacies, how the cemetery accounted for inevitabilities with precision beyond human comprehension. The whispers carried fragments of forgotten conversations, moments of joy or sorrow, fragments of music, laughter, and tears. The watcher moved through it all, ensuring that nothing was lost, that no detail slipped through the meticulous ledger etched into the land. The fog, the cold, the stillness, all of it was part of the cemetery's memory. I realized that the living are temporary observers, passing through a space where stories endure far beyond our understanding. The watcher's presence, always deliberate, always attentive, reminded me that I was not simply guarding stones, but witnessing an eternal record. In that awareness, I felt both humility and awe, knowing that I had become a part of something infinitely larger than myself, bound to the rules, to the names, and to the silent, unyielding memory that Marrow Hill holds. As the final night gave way to dawn, the watcher retreated into shadow among the oldest stones. The fog lifted slightly, and the whispers softened to a gentle hum. leaving only the quiet pulse of the cemetery's memory. I stood alone, lantern dim, heart heavy with the weight of countless lives, yet lighter with the understanding that none of it would be lost. Marrow Hill remembers everything. The living may forget, the world may turn, but here every name, every story, every moment endures. And I, the night watchman, will continue to bear witness, honoring the memory of all who came before, all who will come after, and the eternal balance maintained by the stones and the watcher that moves silently between them. Welcome to Marrow Hill Cemetery, where every life is remembered, every name preserved, and every story lives on forever.